Thank you for Trees for Honolulu's Future to invite me over, and it's a great title, isn't it? Trees for Honolulu's Future, and future is definitely what it's all about. And what I'll do today is really just quickly run through the journey that we've been on in Melbourne for the last decade or so, and certainly would welcome you all to come down to Melbourne. It's a much better city than Sydney. I'm not being parochial in any way, shape or form, and I know if our mayor was here, he'd say that Melbourne's just been voted the most livable city in the world for the 7th year in a row. And you know, partly in a sense, what I'll talk about is how we're trying to make sure that livability is continued into the future. It's a pretty important thing. So here we go. Really, what I want to talk about is the journey that we've been on and where we're heading, and really just to indicate that whilst we've been working fairly solidly over the last decade, in particular with this program, we are just on the way. It's something that you can't just sort of stop and then start. It's what, in a sense, should be day-to-day business within the city. And a lot of our work has been about how to really sort of get day-to-day business as, you know, what we need for the future, and that's change. And in a sense, a lot of what we're about is that sort of change management process. Melbourne's a relatively young city. It was really only founded in the 1830s, and you know, certainly this image is from about 1880, and I'll show you this avenue of plane trees in a moment. But really, it's about the investment. It's around what's the legacy that we want to leave for future generations. We're benefiting from the decisions that were made 150 years ago, and for us it's really, we're at a stage where we now need to invest in the future, and what is the legacy that we leave for our children, our grandchildren, and going onwards, and the city. There's an enormous amount of change that goes on. And if any of you have been to Melbourne, you'd recognise this as the Yarra River, which is the main city that runs through the city, and there's a particularly nice spot here where artists, I think, like to gather. And you'll notice on the left of these images there's a really terrific looking eucalypt, which in a sense, you know, gives us an idea of how we've gone about inhabiting the land and how we've grown our city. And you can see in a relatively short period of time that tree is telling us quite starkly that it doesn't like the way we've gone about developing our city and how we live. And so, you know, you can see in a really short period of time, we've just completely sealed over the land. In a way, we've disconnected our city from nature and from the natural processes, and that's to the detriment of how we experience the space that we live in. And you can see now that that's, on the left is current, on the right is what it was. So the challenge that we've got now, in a sense, is if you look at that image on the left, is how do we reinsert greening into that space to confer all of the benefits that we know come through greening. This is a snap of Melbourne. You can see we've got a central business district, we've got residential areas surrounding, but also what's really important is you can see that those green spaces, and we've got our sort of hero, if you like, was Charles Latrobe, who was planning the city out, and he's very famous for not only the grid network of the central city, but he put aside those spaces for us, and part of the livability of the city is due to that foresight and that planning. So we're benefiting greatly. We obviously won't be able to create those huge green spaces into the future, but we need to be able to confer our legacy to ensure that in 150 years' time, Melbourne is still a fantastic place to live. Quick snapshot, we're a relatively small municipal area, 37.5 square kilometres, relatively small residential population. It's growing rapidly but quite small, but we do have up to 1 million people per day that sort of come in and occupy the city. So it's so in terms of sort of residents, visitors and workers, it's a really, you know, it's a huge number of people and has a strong impact on it. It's highly diverse, 121 different languages that are spoken, and you know, it's something that, you know, we're incredibly proud of. Give an idea of some of the trees. So if you go back to that black and white image that I showed from the 1880s, if you look on the right hand side, that's that avenue of plane trees now. So you can see how absolutely magnificent that is. and the building that's up behind the exhibition building was where that shot was taken from. And this is one of the very few World Heritage listed urban landscapes around the place, and you can sort of see why. Fitzroy Gardens. So we've got a lot of history, a lot that's been left behind, and that's really important. Faulkner Park, Birrung Marr is a new landscape. You can see on the right-hand side of the river, so that was a space that we've created, but the only new space that we've done, and that's by taking up rail yards, so repurposing the city to give us. So you can see we're very fortunate in a lot of what we've got. Our streetscapes on the left with elm trees, on the right Swanson Street, those plains at that stage probably about 15 years old, but a lot of change. But every time change occurs in the city now, we make sure that we are guided by principles which ensure leaving a good legacy for the future. Parks, residential streetscapes, you can see that a lot of our space is dominated by trees that were planted in excess of 100 years ago. A lot of those trees are getting to the end of their natural life, and we're starting to recognise what we need to do. Similar to Honolulu, we're losing green cover. And one of the ways that we go about assessing is to look, this is Landsat imagery that talks about population and percentage green cover. You can see from 1988. If you go to 2009, you can see populations increasing, but there's also a significant loss in green cover. And that's hugely concerning for us, so we're doing a lot to work out how to get that reversed. And we know that there's examples around the world where you can do it. Here's looking at Singapore over the same period of time, where you can see percentage green cover and population, and hold on, go back. So that's 1986, then up to, might have been the wrong way around, sorry. So 2007, some significant increase compared to 1986. And there's fantastic examples from around the world where cities are transforming and starting to look at green cover and livability. And Chongmychong Stream in Seoul is one where we've gone from a freeway to a community space, and that impact is, obviously incredibly sort of striking, very, very powerful, and giving back to the community. The quality and the health of the water is something that's inspirational. Real estate values have gone through the roof of the buildings adjacent. Air quality is much better. The city's much cooler. So all of those benefits have been recorded through that process. Other examples of things that inspired me, like the High Line in New York. I don't know how many of you have had the experience to go over there, but I love this story because the High Line was a defunct elevated rail that the government was going to pull down. Community got together and said, no, we value it, let's look at it. Had a battle, the community won, which was fantastic. And so it's been turned into one of the most magnificent public spaces. And again, the uplift of value from that has been absolutely extraordinary, quite inspiring. And also all the way along the Hudson River, that's being redeveloped, and I like that if you can read the bottom line there is a fence there, but one need never leave the confines of New York to get all the greenery one wishes. What a fantastic sentiment to have, and what a great way to be guided about how you're making change and delivering outcomes. And even, planting trees in spaces, the bottom right-hand side, you can see that's planted out on a wharf. So we've got the ability and the technological ingenuity to really sort of transform. Jumping back to Melbourne, in terms of a context, we're obviously part of that sort of ongoing journey. And these slide I put together, and this was sort of part of the beginnings of the development of our urban forest strategy. There, we came on the back of a 13-year drought, and if you look at the periods of drought, you can see there that there's a fairly significant impact on us. Water restrictions came in, but also the way that we started thinking about the role of vegetation and greening and trees in the city has really transformed. So instead of them being from a heritage perspective or amenity perspective, what we proffer is that the trees, the forest is part of the vital infrastructure of the city. It's just as important as the road network, as the telecommunications, etc. So the green infrastructure will provide us with extraordinary benefits if we get us right, and it makes sense from a livability perspective, from an economic perspective, from a resilience perspective to the changing climate. But you can see that the motivations and the thinking were vastly different for us. We've got, like all cities, we've got extraordinary challenges. population growth, urban heating, climate change are all having a huge impact already on what we do. And for us, really bringing this green infrastructure forward is a key component of our responses to these challenges. And this is our municipal strategic statement. And if you can see, if the colours come up, you can see on the east or the right-hand side are all of those magnificent parks that I talked about, those open green spaces. But a lot of our population growth and densification is occurring down the west or the left-hand side of our municipality. And if you look at it, there's not a chance that we're going to get those huge expanse and those huge tracts. So we've got to work out how it is that we go about inserting green into these spaces. And from a jurisdictional perspective, as council, we have responsibility for 30% of the footprint of the space that we're in, and of that 30%, 80% is in roadways. So for us, rethinking and repurposing the city to give us space, to give us the green, is very much part of what we're going to be doing. And roads in particular offer us a huge opportunity, and this is a bit of forecasting of modal share. And you can see that between 2009 and up to 2030, how people in the city use the road network is going to be transforming. We're moving away from car and motor vehicle use, much more public transport, walking, cycling, etc. So the function of roads, which were traditionally built to just carry a motor vehicle and to capture rainfall and do drainage, they need to offer a lot more. So a lot of our work is rethinking, repurposing. We've got an extraordinary problem with urban heating, both from a heat island effect, then also from extreme heat events. And we have, this is out of the IPCC report, which is talking about the number of extreme heat events that's going to be occurring into the future. And that's really frightening. You know, there's no natural disaster that kills more people in Australia than excessive heat. And when we get 46.4 degrees Celsius in our city, that's extraordinary. Now this occurred during in 2009 in February, and you might have heard we had major bushfires then called Black Saturday bushfires, and 176 people lost their lives directly as a result of the fire. What wasn't really known straight away was that close to 400 people lost their lives because of excessive heat in the weeks in the lead up. So it's really problematic, and so for us, extreme heat is something that we're incredibly conscious of. The climate change and those extreme heats and the increasing temperatures impact not only on people but also on our vegetation. And this is a shot of one of our major boulevards, Royal Parade, where our mean average daily temperature is 15 degrees C. Now if we get 1 or 2 degrees increase in average temperatures, then it's going to be similar to Mildura, which is up towards central Australia, and then a few more degrees, Alice Springs. So for us, if we're making a 100-year decision now about what we're planting, we have to be conscious of what it's going to be like in the future and how do we respond to that. So we can't just keep doing what we've been doing or what's been done for 100 years. We've got to think about the future. A key piece of work that I did in 2009 was to go out and to survey a lot of our trees. This is their useful life expectancy. And here you can see the figures over on the right are telling us that we're going to lose a lot of what we've got. And in particular those heritage landscapes, those big elms that you've seen, and people were highly concerned. And this was a really key piece of work, because a lot of organisations will often sort of go do nothing as a valid management response. So what this does is it shows that if we don't do something, we're going to lose out really badly. So you don't have a choice, you have to act. So what is it that you do when you do act is really critical. And this is a good example of one of our boulevards, St Kilda Road, and those are trees with a very low useful life expectancy. So they don't offer shade, they don't offer wind abatement, they don't intercept rainfall, they don't clean the air, don't do anything really, except a lot of people are very attached to them. And as we all know, they're still alive, it's got one leaf on it, you're not allowed to take it out. So change is difficult. But the drought gave people a lot of things to think about. And if you look at this shot here, you see on the left, it's in health. On the right, it's not in health. And that was what the drought did to us. That's what water restrictions did to us. So you can see the impact, and that made a lot of people stand up and be really concerned about what was going on, because our dams nearly ran dry. But the interesting thing is that in Melbourne, we have more rainfall that falls as stormwater in 12 months than a city needs to use in a year. So whilst we were reliant on a dam system and this fantastic quality water like you've got here, but we were washing our driveways with it, flushing our toilets with it, etc. So there was a huge cultural change. Here's a couple of our premier landscapes, Royal Parade and Fitzroy Gardens, and by simply taking out one species, which is the elm tree, you can see the impact. So we've got a challenge with the dominance of one species, so diversity is an issue, but also I like looking at Royal Parade. We often underestimate the role and the value of trees in our landscape and we take them for granted. Whereas if you look, which street would you rather drive down to keep the energy levels down and the blood pressure down? I'll jump into bits and pieces about our sort of planning, and I think one of the key messages that we've always got across is the last paragraph here, is that what we want to achieve is a city in a forest rather than a forest in a city. So what that's really talking about is that the green matrix within which we live is the base that provides the environment for us. So again, coming back to the importance of that network. So how do we start to achieve doing that is by really thinking about it quite carefully. And probably the key point that I want to make here is that our team is incredibly multidisciplinary. There's not one profession that really owns this space, and it's really up to everybody coming together. And so in the team we've got geographers, planners, we've got landscape architects, we've got social scientists, we've got arborists, all across the board, because all of the aspects need to be brought together. That's super important. The targets, we've heard your mayor indicate the importance of setting visionary targets. You've got to be aspirational. There's no point, you don't have to know how to get there straight away, but you set the target and you work out how to get there along the way. And using science is a really big part of it. Trees, as we all know, can be incredibly emotive, and so we need to somehow combine both the art and the science in getting the outcome that we need. Change is something that a lot of people are really scared of, and it's really hard to get people through there. So I've been incredibly conscious that Melbourne's a brilliant city. We don't want to change it for what it is, we just want to make it better. So we want to be respectful of the past and the culture that goes through. We've heard about the benefits of urban forestry and the research from around the world, whether it talks about recovering from an operation quicker if you're looking out a window at a tree, to decreasing recidivism, to improve quality. It's manifest. There's no shortage of data that tells us how green is good. And I know a colleague did her PhD research looking at green areas within cities and found that people who live in the green suburbs were healthier, happier, wealthier and more intelligent. So we've got no doubt that it's good for us, but how do we take that knowledge and translate that into on-ground outcomes? And that's the challenge, and that's really what a lot of our work is about. So the urban forest strategy was really set up and created to do that. And then, so we've got the strategic document, and then we've got the precinct plans, which are, if you like, the implementation plans of the strategy. It's worth noting that the urban forest strategy sits alongside a suite of other documents that are all about how we go about thinking. So how do we manage water, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, ecology, open space, green roofs, walls, all act together. So these all speak to each other. So this is the way that, if you like, our council operates, and so how we've created it. And so all of these targets are interrelated to improve livability, resilience, all the way through. All of this information is available online. Jumping back to the urban forest strategy, there's 7 principles that sit there. And we, like a lot of cities, would talk about planting trees in a street, and would go out and talk to the community. And we'd end up having a debate about whether it should be native or exotic. And it was kind of, wasting everybody's time. So what we did was to set up principles which everybody can agree to, which isn't about what species of tree you're going to plant, but it's really talking about why we need to plant trees, and to elevate people's thinking above short-term greedy thinking and more about legacy thinking. So climate change, urban heat island, health and well-being, ecosystems, water sensitivity, livability and cultural identity are all things that people value, that are important to them. So it's in a sense easy to get agreement. So we translated those principles into strategies and targets. So for us, we're looking at 40% canopy covered by 2040. We've calculated that we can achieve that within the public realm. This is not in the private realm, so we've modelled what we're going to lose, what we need to plant, etc. Diversity is incredibly important, and whilst we've got just some figures up around there about family, genus and species, age, mixes, a whole range of things are really important. It's got to be healthy. There's no point us talking about having this fantastic environmental service benefit from trees if you don't look after them. Soil moisture and water quality, urban ecology and the community. Because in a sense, the most important element within the forest are the people. So they need to be part of it and they need to be supporting and moving through. So we've gone about it in a lot of ways, and one of my favourite parts is often what we call road dieting. So we've got, sort of benefits of having huge big road expanses everywhere, which are brilliant if you're driving a car, but from a heat retention perspective and other things. So what we're doing is going around transforming those. One of the really important pieces of work that we did was start to look at that remote sensing. And so what you're looking at there is a thermal image of our city at 3 a.m. in the morning after 3 or 4 hot days. So you can see the central business grid, you can sort of see the river snaking through, and what you're seeing there is the red spots of the heat. So for us, if we're saying that we can cool the city by planting trees, this kind of tells us where to plant them. And you can see that the roadworks where we need to cover it, not existing parks. The other thing that I really like about this is that the majority of times we look at a map of the city, we're figuring out where are we going to lunch, which bus are we catching, where are we catching up with Joe for a drink after work. You look at this and you start to think of the city from an ecology perspective, that the city's alive. Those of you that follow tennis, I don't know if you ever watched the Australian Open, and you'll think back and you'll think, what is one of the main topics of conversation? It's how hot centre court is. Look at the bottom right-hand triangle next to the river. It's just got a pointer on it. Next to that sort of circular spot with the blue edge to it, just to the left of that, is the Australian Tennis Open. It's one of the hottest spots in the city. So how we design our city is really important. And here just showing, this is just again a thermal image that shows in the background the verticality, the green. It's not just the ground plane that really works. And I use this, it's one of my favourite trees, and this is a London plane tree that's in Russell Street, and it kind of does everything that we want a tree to do in the city. It's great, it's big, it's got a huge, big, rich canopy. We know that big trees give us 75% more environmental service benefits than small trees. It's not in a footpath that's lifting it up, it's not having to be cleared from property boundaries or from power lines and everything, and it's much bigger than the trees that are up the hill behind us, and we sort of go, why? But if you look at that piece of artwork, that sculpture that's in the foreground, below that used to be an underground toilet. So this tree is sort of growing in an accidental water-sensitive urban design tree pit. So it's getting a feed, it's getting a drink, but it kind of tells us what we need to do in the future. And from a benefit perspective, just look at those surface temperatures under the canopy of the tree. It's half that in the surrounding area. And if we look at it from a two-dimensional surface perspective, the top left is that one tree. So on the left, that block has about 27% canopy cover. On the right, if we just replicated that one tree twice more, we'd get over 40% canopy cover. So in a sense, canopy cover is really important as a measure. It doesn't have to be about tree numbers, but it's about the right tree in the right place, in the right conditions. And it's also about the role of water in the city. This is a park area, unirrigated. In the foreground, it's just bare dirt, so it's just as hot as asphalt. So the role and function of water in cooling the city is absolutely critical. And we do a lot of sort of modelling, we do a lot of demonstrating about how to, and what does that doubling of canopy cover actually start to look like. Road dieting. How do we create the spaces for trees? How do we create the spaces for parks and for permeability and for people? And this is an example of one project. So on the left you see the before, on the right's the after. You can see on the left where it says Crown Land, so that was a 500 square metre patch. On the right we've now got a 5,000 square metre park, and we've simply done that by reducing asphalt. So it's repurposing the city, rethinking. And what we have on the right is a great space for people. Just up the top right of this image is a primary school. And we've now got, instead of a complex two-way system that was dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists, and it's a major bus route, we've now got a one-way system, so it's much safer. The other really good thing about this is that council owns the road. So if we were going to create a park in this area of North Melbourne, it would have cost us about $18 million to purchase that land. We built that park for $2 million. So it makes sense to repurpose, to change things over. And that's that park. So it's got water-sensitive urban design, other trees. The other really good thing about this is that we have fantastic support within our hierarchy. And so this was the release a couple of years ago of our capital works plan. So front and centre is our green infrastructure. So our elected officials recognise the value of creating parks and doing things there. This is another project that we're doing, South Bank Boulevard. You can see the dashed line between the park and the river. So what we're doing there, that road was originally built to transport about 50,000 vehicles a day. They changed the end destination, so it dropped down to about 10,000 people per day. So we can reduce it down to 2 lanes on the northern side. We'll get a 2.5 hectare linear park out of that. That'll cost us about $33 million to do. If we'd gone out and purchased it at land value, $175 million. So that's an area that's sort of really important. So it makes sense, it's sort of common sense for us to do this sort of thing and to create spaces for trees. And another project, University Square, you can see sort of a small space that's ringed by road network. One of the things that we do from a community perspective is, instead of going out and giving people sort of option A and option B because we're the professionals and we know best, we actually go out to the community and ask them what they want. And so when we went out and said, what do you want us to do in University Square, this is what came back. So this forms the basis of what we call an ideas plan, which we then put back and then develop up. And it's a really good way to get support for what you do, and rather than have opposition, and obviously it aligns to all of our strategic directions that we put together. And this is where we got up to with translating that ideas plan coming across. And what's fantastic about this project is that we'll get about a 40% increase in green space. We're getting rid of 2 roadways completely, and we're creating a space that's going to be active and well used and loved by the community, and we get a significant increase in trees. And some of the graphics, if you look at the sort of the existing and then below, just look from that grey line to that green line in terms of permeability, etc., and activity, it's going to make a huge difference. There's going to be a lot of on-site activity. We're partnering with the university to manage and deliver some of the outcomes that come through. And you know, it'll be super exciting. We do a lot of monitoring and evaluation. You need to know where you're going, how you're performing, where you need to get to. And so on a regular basis, on an annual basis, we remap our canopy cover, we break it down to precincts. So we measure progress against where we need to get to. And being able to convey that and to keep the story going is super important for us. And you can see overall in the city we're tracking really quite well to get up to that 40% canopy cover. Some areas are going to be lower, some will be higher. Diversity is something that you can't underestimate the importance of. And this particular sort of issue highlighted for me that monocultures aren't really good. If some of you are really lucky enough to have had a canal boat holiday in France, you might have gone down the Canal du Midi, which runs from Toulouse down to the Mediterranean, and it's a World Heritage listed landscape. And it's that because somebody 100 plus years ago had the foresight to plant, I think, 24,000 London plane trees. The French government's now removing 24,000 London plane trees because one fungus has got in. And that fungus has been transferred up and down by the ropes that tie the boats to the bank overnight. So a monoculture can be devastating. So you can lose a lot if you don't look after it. In our central business district, early on we thought that London planes were this bulletproof tree that would grow anywhere and be fantastic. We found out they're not, but we have 75% of our trees in the CBD are one species. So we've got to a lot of effort to set targets for the future to transform that and to get agreement. So now whenever tree change occurs, we keep London planes in a couple of our major streets, but the rest are transforming to evergreens and deciduous. So we have agreed plans in place that just enable us to get on and do the work. And it's a really important aspect of what we're doing now is that we've had the discussions, we've had the debates. Now we just get on and do the work. So every time we go out and do something, we don't have to reopen that can of worms and discuss it. It's not always as easy as that, but it gets sort of pretty close. The other piece that we did, which is a really good piece of research that we did in conjunction with Melbourne University, was to try and get an understanding of what trees we should be planting, what of the species that we have existing that are going to cope with those rising temperatures into the future. So we looked at a lot of cities around the world, and what we found out was that one of the most limiting factors for trees is increasing heat. That the plasticity of species is quite limited in some cases. So what we've done is evaluated all of our existing and what future trees. So that's a really important piece of work for us that guides what we plant, and particularly when some of our heritage trees, and there's a lot of cultural value in those, aren't going to be good trees into the future. So we don't plant them now because they're not going to be good. In terms of sort of thinking about the city as a whole, and if you go right back to my early slides, we've got a really challenging space to actually get trees and greening occurring. So we started to look at the built form, we started to look at the private realm as well as the public realm, and what are the partnerships that we need to deliver the green outcomes, what's the potential of the city. So we started to do a lot of mapping of the existing to understand what it can achieve, then set those aspirational targets. So we started to look at green roofs and their walls, etc. And we developed up this Growing Green Guide, which is a how-to guide. That industry is very much in its infancy in Australia and in Melbourne, so this guide is something that's really valuable. We put it up on the website, I think in 2014, and it's been downloaded something like 150,000 times. So definitely from that. And then we started to look at how do we understand what we can do. So we did some analysis of opportunities, and we looked at one block which told us, as you can see on the right-hand side, that a lot of the existing buildings have great capacity to support green roofs. So we stepped that up and did a thing called the rooftop project that we doubled with looking at solar and cool roofs. And then we wanted to create a spatial representation, and we want to share that data. We've got a fantastic open data platform, so anytime we do research, we make that available for the community and others to look at. And what we did was to go in and have a look at the existing buildings and understand their capacity to support things. Then we've mapped that, and this is the results. And the one that sort of amazes me, if you think of my aerial picture of the city, you notice a lot of green spaces. There's about 500 hectares of green space. If you look at the bottom right-hand figure, in terms of extensive green roofs, if we put a green roof on all of those buildings, we'd get another 250 hectares of green space. So it's almost 50% again. And there's enormous potential in that, in its capacity to provide. And we use a range of visualisations to look at that's, all of the green buildings there have the capacity to support an extensive green roof, and that one's intensive green roofs and walls. So there's an ability to do it, and how can that help us? If you look at this map here, it's what we call the Elizabeth Street catchment, and that's one water catchment that fits entirely within our municipal boundary, so we can have an impact on looking at that. And where it meets the river down the bottom, there's sort of a bit of a blockage, and we often get floods, which is a bit problematic for shopkeepers and trams and public transport and those things. But we worked out that the current rating from our water authority is extreme for a flood event, and if we wanted to shift that down to high, then we'd need to hold back 6.8 megalitres of water, which seems like a lot. But when we modelled the capacity, if we put extensive green roofs in that catchment, we discovered that if 25% of the buildings that could support a green roof put it in, they'd hold back close to 30 megalitres of water. So in terms of avoidance of flood and impact, the capacity is absolutely extraordinary, and the capacity to model is really quite powerful. So as we're now starting to look at mandating for green roofs through a planning scheme, this sort of information is highly valuable in supporting that business case to get that locked in. We also sort of look at untapped potential, and we did a bit of work around greening your laneway. And some of you, if you know Melbourne, it's quite famous for its laneways, but mostly for its coffee shops and other things like that. But we also did a bit of evaluation, and we went in and looked at something like 200 odd laneways that we've got. We looked at it for solar, we looked at it for wind, we looked at it from physical access, so where do we need the trucks and vehicle movements and all those sorts of things. And then we worked out that we had something like, from a wall perspective, 170 hectares of walls that were available for greening and about 45 hectares of ground plane. So again, huge potential. So we did that evaluation, then we put it out to the community and said, are you interested in partnering with us? Because if we're going to green a wall, we don't own the wall, we need the building owner to sort of do it. So we thought, how do we get into that private-run partnership? So we put this up online for 2 weeks. We had over 800 nominations come back in 2 weeks. We evaluated those and ended up doing 4 laneways. And so that's been an exciting prospect. And it was interesting that once we'd announced that we were going to do them, I noticed there was a shop for renting one of the laneways. And so the real estate advertising was soon to be one of Melbourne's green your laneways. You know, people get it, that it's a really important thing to do, and it's a visualisation of one of the laneways. So in terms of environmental service provision, social health and wellbeing, connectedness, partnering, people are paying to green, which is really, really important for us. Health is something that's super critical, and this was a bit of work that we did going back into about 2010, 2011 to look at a couple of our landscapes that show us how far we are away from our ideal. And so this sort of information started to really drive a lot of the work that we do, including budgets, etc. We're also very conscious of the potential impact and loss through pest and disease with climate change and increasing globalisation. So we use a lot of our GIS data to map vulnerability, that if one disease came in, and particularly on the left, Dutch elm disease, and you know what happened in the UK and over in the US, there was extraordinary loss. We haven't got it, but the potential's there. So for us, our monitoring and evaluation of various diseases and pests is obviously sort of prime and super important. And being able to convey that and the threat of loss is really important for us. And we do a lot of monitoring because of the port. I mean, recently we had Asian longer-corn beetle came in untreated timber pallets from China. So that had, you know, potential to sort of wipe out. So it's really important. I stressed a little bit about water, and really you can't think about the urban forest without the water component. And we put in a lot of time and energy into our partnerships and sort of working into research. And a couple of bits of research are really interested. You can sort of see that a really good canopy can reduce peak floods and really quite substantial, but also reducing urban land temperature. You know, that 10 to 15% increase in tree cover can really reduce it by up to 4 to 5 degrees C. So it's great being able to sort of say and to state and to use overseas examples, but there's nothing better than local research and local knowledge and local data to support what you're doing, especially as you're mounting business cases. So it's really important to learn, but to gather your own data. And also recognising the natural function. I think in a naturally forested area, 80% of the rainfall is transpired by the trees. The other 20% hits the ground and goes into the ground. You know, at the moment in a city, it's probably the reverse of that. About 80% of that sort of hits roofs and roads and gets polluted and put out into the bays and rivers and impacts on the reefs. This is what happens to us when Elizabeth Street floods. Our famous trams stop. And, you know, we've sort of modelled the damage. So integrated water management for that is for us absolutely critical. And so again, looking at that, you can see on the plan, you can see that blue line, that's sort of that extreme flood event. So you can see it travels a long way back up the street and then starts to dissipate into the surrounding shops. So it has enormous economic impact when it comes through. So for us, what we've done is modelled that space. What are the opportunities and how do we go about doing it? And then we set targets to work. So now when we're starting to look at budgets, etc., this sort of information is what's required to an output. So if the engineering services team are looking at their road resurfacing, then permeability is a key part of that, and planting trees is a really key part of it as well. Some of the examples of how we go about doing things, these are water-sensitive urban design pits in sort of a built-up area, residential area, and I know from our tree crews, sort of anecdotally, when we put these in, they require about 75% less water during their first 2 years of establishment. So it makes sense, it's logical, it's a space below ground. We do a lot of stormwater harvesting. This is in East Melbourne, where we tap into existing stormwater pipes, put them into storage tanks, pump it through the rain gardens into a holding tank, and then use that for irrigation. So for us, we're up to close to 30% of our water requirements for trees and green spaces through stormwater that's been harvested. Obviously, the water quality is significantly better, and various ones we do. This is in Eads Place in West Melbourne, but simply we took out some large trees, we put in structural soils, put porous asphalt over the top and replanted trees into it. So we've got about 500 square metres of permeable area, which is suitable for car parking, but it allows the water to go in and creates a fantastic space for trees to grow. And also in our sort of civic areas, we've been rolling out bluestone paving throughout as part of the quality of the city, but the engineers love it because they put it on a concrete slab that's reinforced and it's about that thick. But if you're a tree, you don't like that so much. And from a heat perspective, it really adds a lot. So what we're doing is we've just come up with a well-designed output, which is structural soils, back of curb, paving units within sand. So we've got permeability, we've got transpiration, we've got spaces for the trees to grow. We also do a lot of work around advocacy. If you're interested in any of the work that we've done around urban water, we've got an urban water website which really talks about both for general community to understand sort of the water cycle, what it's about. So education's a really important part of what we actually do. We also put in a lot of learnings, and as I say up the top, it's largely for our community conversation about making the invisible visible. And here you can see a 5 meg water tank in Fitzroy Gardens. What we did was reduce the depot down by 50%, put the water tank underneath, and then returned green space to the community. You can see on the right with a cafe there. That gives us about 80% of our water requirements for that space, which is pretty good. And technical details on how these fly-throughs work and different things, and then some of our learnings with tech notes, etc. So it's a very valuable website. Ecology is something that we're incredibly conscious of the value of in the city, and a lot of people have been talking about the importance of biodiversity. They've been talking about the importance of recreating natural vegetation to support the biodiversity. From my perspective, really, as we look into the future, it's not about trying to re-establish what was here in the past, but it's about understanding and thinking about what the future ecology of our city can be and how that can prefer a lot of benefits for us. So we've recently done our Nature in the City strategy that was put through in 2017, so last year, and that's really about understanding what we've got, how we can sort of go ahead. But the really interesting thing for me was that when we started looking at biodiversity, I went and talked to all of the professors and the museums and things. Well, what have we actually got? What are we looking after? And nobody knew. You know, there was very scant information around what was the ecology of the city. I mean, we know about possums and foxes and the things that we don't like, fruit bats and things like that. But we didn't have a lot of knowledge about what was there. So we've undertaken a series of what we call bioblitzes, so community science, where we just sort of go out and get people monitoring. And we've discovered some of the most amazing things. And one of them, we have these microbats that live in some of our major parks. They're about the size of a matchbox. And I'd never sort of really heard about them. They're these incredibly ugly looking little tiny things. But what I found out from talking to bat specialists is that they have creche trees. So all of the kids go in and get looked after by one or two of the adults. And then they have flying school. So there's 2 or 3 adults that go out and teach all of the young bats to fly. But you never see them because it's at night time when they come out. But they each one eats 15,000 mosquitoes per day, etc., etc. So again, making the invisible visible is really important for us. And one of the things that we did was work with researchers, and we developed this book. It's a children's book. And that's come out of a piece of research where we commissioned the university to go out and understand about a range of about 20 or 30 different species. And then we've converted to that, and we now go out and do book readings in primary schools and different things. But again, that really important sort of educative component of what we do. We've got a very strong citizen forester program where we have about 350 people signed up that sort of go through an indoctrination process with us, perhaps an induction process. But what we do is really sort of get them to do a lot of the work that we aren't able to do, and sort of go out, and whether it's eye trees, sort of monitoring. This one is in particular, we're looking at the elm's genetics, so they're out collecting leaves for us, but going out and we do hollow blitzes and all sorts of things, and it's a very valuable one for bringing people on board, and the benefits are really sort of manifest, and people just love it. And we found that going out and talking to the community through all of our research and engagement was that there was this overwhelming desire to work with us. So this program is really there to enable people to actually do the work. I talked about sort of art and science coming in. We often use art whenever possible, and we did some work around connecting people to nature, and we had an artist who was there drawing it up and capturing what was the dialogue there. So, you know, it's really sort of quite important. Obviously, Melbourne's very famous for its trams, and then we're talking about nature corridors and connecting people with nature. So I think it's important to share the joy of what we're doing at the same time as we're working with science. And I'll focus a little bit on community engagement, and probably one of the most important things that we did was go out and talk to the community. And as we're developing up the strategy, I think I started talking in about 2009, and I think I've nearly stopped talking. But for the first 3 years, it was really just going out and talking to people and getting the community on board. And it was really, for me, understanding, support, what are the values of the community? Is what we're thinking is the right thing to do reflected by those values? So it's a really important feedback loop. Be meaningful, be really honest. And I can remember talking to our marketing people, and I was doing some press releases, and they said, write it as though it's for a 12-year-old. And it was a completely wrong thing to do. So we've gone out and had a really educated conversation, and we've learnt so much. It's been absolutely really important. And empowering. And I think that when we were talking, climate change was probably at its peak. And I think most of the people in the community thought that climate change belonged to that lab-coated scientists up in CSIRO in Canberra. What we've done is convinced everybody that by taking an urban forest approach, everybody has a way to respond to climate change. So it's incredibly empowering for people. And we know that the partnership that we need, it isn't about government solely doing it, it's about everybody coming together and acting. So we use the IAPT spectrum. So over that collaborate, empower is where we started to operate. It takes more time, and you have to be a little bit brave. And a lot of local governments are often a bit afraid of allowing people to have decision-making abilities, but the more you do that, the better outcome that you actually get. And that sort of participatory governance is a really rich and rewarding space to actually get into. And we also recognise that we're in a changing world. You know, we know we have sort of the typical town hall meetings with the usual suspects that are there, but we wanted to get out to the silent majority. We know that baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, millennials all have different motivations and different ways to communicate. So we did a lot of work around it. We did Urban Forest, the video. We went out and had an art and design competition that was really, really very rich. And some of the stuff and the imagery that's sort of come back, that one on the left, is used all over the place now with sort of greening the city with green roofs, etc. Children get it more than anybody else gets it, you know, and it's really simple. So how do we empower them and have their voice come in and have that, you know, environment which is for the 8-year-olds and for the 80-year-olds, and not just for fit, healthy 35-year-olds that a lot of people tend to design cities for. We commissioned artists like Michael Looney to do an urban forest painting for us. We partnered with other sort of sectors, and that was a doctor that talked about the importance of trees and air quality. So for us, we're recognising that having external champions was really important for us. There's nothing like somebody else advocating for your work. It carries 7 times the weight than if you stand up and talk about it yourself. And for us, doctors are one of the most recognised, respected professionals, so why not them tell people to plant trees and to write green prescriptions rather than for value, you know, go out and walk in a park instead and get some exercise. And in a sense, if we're talking about improving health and well-being, who's going to get the benefit from that? The medical system. How do we get the dollars that's saved in the medical system turned into greening so that we reduce it? You know, our studies during heat waves and having cooler cities showed that visitation from ambulances dropped right down. So the data's there. Our Lord Mayor Robert Doyle at the time, he was a great champion, and I think sort of echoing your Mayor's comments there's few political, budgetary or policy decisions that must deliver for people in 100 years' time. How do we get away from the political term and the financial year to making and getting everybody to agree what those long-term decisions are? It's super important. So we had a fantastic dialogue with our major newspapers and the media. We had editorials that were written that were unasked for. So a lot of people, you know, the planet sort of aligned in a way, and it was really good. We had on the left, you can see Susie Holt from South Yarra, and I have to be a little bit cynical, she's got a shop in the city that sells Gucci handbags. She didn't like what we were doing, but then the Friends of the Elms came out and said, but it's really good. So people will defend you, so you don't have to defend yourself. You know, the Lord Mayor, and he sort of, I think we're doing a monthly column at the time, sort of wrote about it. The other thing that we found was that in our discussions, people wanted to work with us, wanted to connect to nature. So we're thinking about all of the ways to do that, and one of them was to make our data available for everybody. So we've created this website, and you can jump on board now. And so all the information that we've got about our trees is available for people that can go on and just click, and it'll tell you what the species is, what the useful life expectancy is. And then we thought, wouldn't it be great if people could, you know, sort of help out and let, you know, you can do some analysis on useful life expectancy, but we thought if people could let us know if there was a problem with a tree, it would be really good. So we gave each of our trees an individual email address. So you can go and click onto any of our trees, and if you're so minded, you can write it an email. And we thought this will be good. People will tell us it's, you know, got a branch down or whatever. And on the right there, you can see those white dots are all of the trees that have received emails. What we found though was that we created this space where people wanted to express their emotional connection to trees. So we've ended up with many years of almost love letters written to our trees. We've had trees in the Florida Everglades writing to our trees. We've got trees in Austria writing to our trees. We had somebody in Greece who was writing to one of our cedars to get advice on the global financial crisis, which was interesting because we were working with an economist at the time, so we got him to write this detailed response. But the closeout line was, but what would I know? I'm only a tree. So what's sort of interesting though is that this is a golden elm at the corner of Punt Road and Swanson Street. This is the most emailed tree in our municipality. And it was sort of fortunate in a way because we've got pressures on roads and our road traffic engineers wanted to widen the road here. And we suggested that that wouldn't be wise because that's the most loved tree in Melbourne. They changed their design. So how do we start to get community values sort of going in? And these are just a selection of them, but some of them are incredibly powerful and moving about, you know, a mother going to visit her child in hospital and passing particular trees, and so really quite rare. We're doing a bit of research around them. I thought I'd share this one with you, which is quite funny. So we had Jamie writing to this particular tree, and then the tree, which is a Chinese elm, wrote back to Jamie, so they got into a bit of a dialogue, and Jamie didn't like calling it Chinese elm 1030595, so he called the tree Dale, which was really good. And then they talked about what their weekend was like, and a lot of Australians like to drink a lot of beer and get dehydrated over the weekend, so they shared their experience with rehydration and dehydration going through there, which was really quite funny. And Melbourne is often known as the sporting capital of the world, and we have our local AFL teams. And so one of the most, there's always one team that's hated, right? So that's Collingwood. So of course, Jamie's asking Dale to drop a branch on a Collingwood player's head as the Collingwood player walks past. But this is sort of something that inadvertently became a bit of a phenomenon which has got sort of worldwide coverage, whether it's through the Smithsonian or Gizmodo. We've had our councillors interviewed on BBC radio in the UK about emailing a tree. So it's, in a way, what we've done is sort of given people a 21st century ability to hug a tree, you know, which is really important. So we've connected, and we've created a space for people to connect, and it's really important. Whilst it's a bit of fun, it's really valid, and it's actually really easy to do. And just sort of run through a few bits of communication slides. And so change I've talked about and how it's difficult. And so what we do is talk about, well, what does 40% canopy cover look like? The same as what you've got, only much better. So it's not going to be a change to the detriment. And potential loss, we did a bit of work with our useful life expectancies to gather for people. So looking at this part of Birrarungmar, which used to be a road, so the elm trees along the edge, this was them in the 1950s. We took the trees out, superimposed them with modelled trees through a GIS-linked camera from a helicopter flight. So what we've done is to show that if we don't act very quickly, you're going to end up with a landscape which has nothing. But if you act in that successional planning and active. By the time you get down to 20 years down the track, you've got a mature landscape. And it's a really simple choice to make. We know that change is going to occur, that we're going to lose stuff, but if you want a mature landscape, to run it that way. And some of the feedback that we got from the community through our processes was really quite fantastic. Professor Lindsay Falvey from the university talked about the importance of applied science in doing what we do. And that intercity rivalry, the third one in the dark, you can see it's a great idea and one that I'm sure we'll see replicated in Sydney in the not too distant future. We're not competitive between cities. And just to sort of run through really sort of quickly, I think the other point that I'd like to make is that we developed up the precinct plans for the urban forest with the community. We put a lot of time and effort into it, and we've created a lot of wordles. And what's important here is that this is looking at 2 precincts. So the top left and bottom right are what people want their future urban forest to look like, and across there was their character of it. And you can see that there's repetition, and so this is highly valuable when we go to our elected officials and ask for budgets, because we're telling them what the community wants. And what they want is green, and they want leaves and shady, and we did a lot of work understanding preferences for us. You can see on the left, consistently people want colour. It's more about nature in the city to develop up these plans. These are all online. We co-designed with the community, so the vision statement within each of these is written by the community. It's not by us imposing, it's the community going out there and actually establishing what it is that we want to see. And quickly you can see on the left, these aren't just tree planting plans, they're ones which understand the ecology of the city, the soils, the hydrology, the aspect, etc. It's really super important, jumping through. And I'll finish off just by really sort of talking about one landscape that we did which kind of embodies everything. So this is what's called Return to Royal Park. So that on the right hand side, there was a new hospital built, it shifted the old hospital left, and that was an at-grade car park. And what we did was to bring in the traditional owners. You know, these are communities that have had 50,000 years of living in our landscape. So what can we learn from them? So we brought in their 7-season calendar rather than the imposed 4-season European calendar, and applied their thinking. We did children's story times, and so we've got things like eel season and other things, so stories that the kids really related to, and created a landscape which is about nature play. It's it's connected with the hospital, so we worked with them. So we've got disability access coming through, and you can see there's somebody in a wheelchair on a drip being taken through, and the doctors talk about connecting to children, and they find when they use the landscape as a common ground, they access the children much easier and get much more. There's a kid on a hospital gurney being taken through the water feature there. So as part of their way of working and healing children, they use the landscape. And very briefly, a couple of quick initiatives that are current. One is the Urban Forest Fund. So we've gone out and put together a fund of dollars. So we'll match dollar for dollar anybody that wants to build a green roof or wall on private ground. And we've got a lot of people that are coming through. We put in, I think we started with 1.5 million, but you can see there that we've got an aim to have sort of, $20 million worth. And there's some figures there, really in the infographic, talking about what we can create with those sort of dollars. So it's incredibly powerful. And we've got so many people coming through, particularly developers, wanting to work with us to understand and do things. We've got a current summer campaign because of the excessive heat, so we work with our marketing people to come up with the slogan, the new cool. I wanted the new urban cool, but we got landed with the new cool. That still works, but really it's about getting people's attention and having these sort of visual boards, and it's really a call for action for people to come on board and then giving them information where to go to. It's sort of really powerful. And I think it's worth not underestimating the power of nature in people's lives. This is a spot in Birrumah where we did a stormwater harvesting. We had 3,000 square metres of bare dirt left, and we were going to turf it, and I said, let's put it in a wildflower meadow. So we did that, and you can see how magnificent that is and the contrast that's up there. But we had more feedback from the community about that wildflower meadow than anything else. And it's simple, all we did was just rake the soil, sprinkle some seed, water it. Yet, it became one of the most talked about. It was sort of the backdrop photos for the weather report on television, and people were getting their wedding videos done in it and were sending them in to us. And it was interesting that sort of on the left hand side there, sort of on February the 14th, we lost most of the flowers about 1 metre into it, so it was Valentine's Day, so the community was getting into it. But you know, you can't underestimate the sort of biophilic connect that we have with nature and the importance of this in people's lives. And in one way, one of the things that we can do to be really successful is to be purveyors of delight, because it connects people. The other thing that we do is submit a lot of our work for awards, and I'll sort of unashamedly sort of show that we've got sort of state, national and international awards for all of our work. That's really powerful, and it's also representative of an international network that we're part of, and the exchange. And I think in a way we need to recognise that there's something in this for everybody, and celebrating what you do is really important, and people recognise the power of this sort of thing. And just to show up, this was one of the national awards from the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects. And certainly I think what I like about it is that it talks and recognises the transformational policy and active citizen engagement and the practice for creation and management and enhancement of urban forests. It's important that we get it together and we continue on for a long period of time. And a couple of people that I really like are Bill McDonald and Tim Beatley, that are in the biophilic city space, and really talk about the importance of having nature at the heart of the design, and that it's scalable through all sort of planning. And at the bottom line, we want to create spaces for people. We don't have to do it in the average way of having dozens of small trees and footpaths. Look at that for a green cover, you know, and that's Pinus pioneer, so you can make your pesto sauce from the outputs of that as well. But really, it's incredibly important that nature is at the heart of the thinking and design of what we do. And thank you.